Hey everybody, Qroo here. Welcome to the channel. Today I'm going to be covering another subjunctive trigger, and here it is. If there are at least two clauses in a sentence, and the action in one clause is dependent on the action in the other clause occurring first, then the action that has to occur first will be in the subjunctive. I know some of you are like, what did Paul just say? Don't worry, the description makes it sound a lot more complicated than it actually is. When you see the examples, you'll be like, this is a cakewalk. This is easy. So let's go ahead and take a look at an example, all right? Avísame cuando tengas la información. Advise me when you have the information, right? So let's take a look at that sentence. What do we have going on here? Well, we have two clauses separated by the word cuando, which means when. This is different than some of the subjunctive triggers you're used to because those are all introduced by que. So you got in the habit of looking for que and go, oh, maybe it's a subjunctive thing. Now this one's going to be different. We're going to be using cuando or another type of time expression that's very similar. I'm going to be talking about other time expressions a little later in the video. Right now, let's just focus on cuando. So our first clause is avísame, advise me. This is going to be in the imperative mood, also known as the command form. And then we have cuando, when, and the action in that next clause is what has to occur first before you're advised, right? When are you going to advise me? When you have the information. Am I going to advise you before I have the information? No. And that tells us that that verb will have to be in the subjunctive. And it is. Here we have tengas, which comes from the verb tener, right? So let's take a look at that first word in the sentence again. We have avísame, which comes from the verb avisar, which means to advise. And when you say avísame cuando, it's like saying, let me know when something. So this is a great sentence starter. And if you want to make it into a formula, you can put on your word list like avísame cuando plus subjunctive. That's how I would do it. Avísame cuando tengas la información. Avísame cuando llegues. Advise me when you arrive. That comes from llegar. Let's see if you can do a couple just using that sentence starter. Avísame cuando plus subjunctive. All right. How about advise me when you want to go to the beach? Try that one. Avísame cuando quieras ir a la playa. Did you get quieras with AS? Boom. Nice. Nice job. How about this one? Advise me when you're ready, or like let me know when you're ready. Avísame cuando estés listo or lista. Listo for males, lista for female. For you folks who aren't too familiar with the imperative mood, the one I'm showing you, avísame with an A in there in the middle, that's going to be the informal or the tu form, right? If you want to use the usted form, all you're going to do is change that A to an E. Avísame. They sound very similar, especially when you're quick with it. Avísame, avísame. Very close. So if you mess up, I'm sure you're going to be all right. The subjunctive trigger I'm showing you today doesn't always use the imperative. A lot of times you're going to see the future tense. For example, we'll eat dinner when Juan arrives. When we'll eat dinner? When Juan arrives. So that tells us that Juan arriving is going to be in the subjunctive, right? So we have our future tense, we'll eat dinner, cenaremos, or you could say vamos a cenar. Cuando, when what happens? Juan arrives. Cuando llegue Juan or cuando Juan llegue. You have some flexibility when it comes to verb subject order in Spanish. Not a big difference between those two. How about this one? We plan to go to the beach when it stops raining. All right? Now, there's different ways to say you're planning on doing something in Spanish. One of the ones I really like is to use the verb pensar, which means to think, plus the infinitive. That is to plan to do something. So, what's our first clause? Pensamos ir a la playa. We plan to go to the beach. Okay. Cuando? Oh, now we're going to pay attention. So we're planning to go to the beach when something else happens. What's that going to tell us? Subjunctive trigger. When it stops raining. A construction I like to say that something stops is dejar plus de plus infinitive. When it stops raining. Cuando deje de llover. We stick it all together. Pensamos ir a la playa cuando deje de llover. In the sentences I've shown you so far, cuando's been right in the middle of the sentence. Makes it a little bit easier to recognize the trigger, but sometimes cuando will actually begin the sentence. For example, you might see something like, Cuando recibes el mensaje, envíamelo. When you receive the message, send it to me. So our word order is a little bit different. We still have an imperative, but it's at the end, right? And the action that had to occur first is in the beginning, but it's still being introduced by cuando. So right after cuando, we have recibas, and it comes from recibir, to receive, right? It's in the subjunctive. But just because you see the word cuando separating two clauses doesn't mean the subjunctive is always used. For example, If the action we're talking about is a habitual action, the subjunctive is not used. Here's an example of that. We always get up when the rooster starts to crow. Siempre nos levantamos cuando el gallo empieza a cantar. And yes, roosters crowing are really roosters singing, cantar. You can put that on your word list, just in case you're interested. So no subjunctive. That's why it's empieza a cantar and not empiece, right? Let's compare that sentence to one that's very similar, but that will require the subjunctive, okay? Just so you can see the difference. We're going to get up when the rooster crows. So do you see the difference? Here we have a future action. We're going to get up when something else occurs, right? That has to occur first. That's going to trigger the subjunctive. So that's going to look more like this. Vamos a levantarnos cuando el gallo empiece a cantar. When you're looking at your sentences and you see words like siempre, always, or the verb soler, which means to usually do something, then those types of things are going to be your indication that this is habitual action. Since I just brought up the verb soler, to usually do something, let's go ahead and talk about it because I think it's a fantastic verb. And it's definitely one that you should stick in your Spanish toolbox if it's not there already. This is an irregular verb, so I'm going to go ahead and give you the conjugations in the present tense. There they are on the screen. And you'll notice I even stuck in vosotros. I don't personally ever use vosotros, but I know you vosotros fans have been like, Paul, if you can just put that in there, I mean, does it really hurt you to do so? I guess not, so there it is, all right? Soler is an easy verb to use. You just pop in your infinitives. Let's go ahead and translate the sentence we had before, but let's use soler. Solemos levantarnos cuando el gallo empieza a cantar. We usually get up when the rooster starts to crow. Pretty easy, right? You see how nicely this verb works? I like it a lot. Here are a couple more examples using soler. Suelo cenar a las 6. I usually eat dinner at 6. Solemos ir a la playa los fines de semana. We usually go to the beach on the weekends. María suele estudiar todos los días. Maria usually studies every day. What a power verb, right? I'm actually going to do a separate video just about this verb because I know not everyone watches the Subjunctive Triggers series and everybody should have this one in their toolbox. Okay, I really went off on a tangent there, but I'm going to bring it back to what the lesson's about. And I'm going to give you a super useful sentence starter that is a very useful way to start a request. Cuando tengas tiempo, when you have time, and then whatever you need done, right? And that sentence starter is in the informal you or the tú form. If you want to use it as usted, you just have to drop that S. Cuando tenga tiempo, whatever you need. Cuando tengas tiempo, me haces un favor? When you have time, can you do me a favor? And the formal would be, cuando tenga tiempo, me hace un favor. Just dropping some S's there. I've talked about this before. Spanish often uses the present tense as a nice way to ask for something. We'll use this a lot in restaurants. You know, the waiter's going by, is really busy, and you're like, oh, cuando tenga tiempo, me trae más servilletas? When you have time, will you bring me more napkins? So far in the video, we've only been using cuando in our constructions, but there are a couple of other time expressions that you're likely to see that will still trigger the same result. Here's one of them, en cuanto. As soon as. En cuanto tengas la información, as soon as you have the information. Some of you may be thinking, okay, I thought like en cuanto meant referring to. It's actually something I use a lot. Well, en cuanto a, 3 words, that means referring to something or in reference to. En cuanto a lo que me dijiste ayer, in reference to what you said to me yesterday, 3 words, en cuanto a. You drop the a, it has a different meaning. En cuanto, as soon as. Here's another time construction you're likely to see with the subjunctive trigger. Una vez que, meaning once. Una vez que tengas la información, once you have the information, whatever. Now you could easily replace en cuanto or una vez que with just cuando. That's super easy. So when you're talking, I recommend you just stick to cuando, but when you're listening to people, just be aware that some of these other time constructions may trigger that subjunctive. All right. Now I want to talk about another time expression that does not follow this pattern, and that is antes de que, meaning before. This is a time expression I spoke about in the very first episode of Subjunctive Triggers. Antes de que always takes the subjunctive. Always. Even if it's habitual action. Okay? Always. Quiero limpiar la casa antes de que Juan llegue. I want to clean the house before Juan arrives. Suelo limpiar la casa antes de que Juan llegue. I usually clean the house before Juan arrives. See? Subjunctive, subjunctive, even in the habitual statement. That's why I put it in a completely separate category, but I thought it was important to mention here because I can see where people would confuse that time expression with what I'm talking about here. And I guess if you logically think about it, you're like, yeah, why doesn't it follow that pattern? I don't know, it just doesn't. So there you go, there's your answer. So should we go ahead and talk about this one in the past tense using this trigger? Sure, why not, right? Some of you folks watching have been asking me to talk more about the imperfect subjunctive, so this is for you. You folks that are more at the beginner level, you can be like, that's enough of that video. I'd say that I use this construction that we're talking about today most in the past tense when I'm talking about some completed action, like I'm telling a story to someone. For example, I told him to advise me when he arrived. Let's break this one down into sections because we actually have two subjunctive triggers at work here. Our first one is right in the beginning. I told him to advise me, right? You're telling someone to do something. You're expressing influence over them. So that's going to be the subjunctive. So first you have, I told him that. Le dije que. To advise me. That's going to have to be in the imperfect subjunctive, the past, because we have to have tense agreement. Le dije que me avisara. When he arrived. So we're not talking about habitual action, are we? No. So this is also going to have to be in the imperfect subjunctive. Cuando llegara. We put it all together. Le dije que me avisara cuando llegara. It can get more complex when speaking in the past, but again, just kind of break it down in your mind into little sections. Well, that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, just do me a favor and give it a thumbs up. And until next time, hasta luego.